Hello, folks. Welcome to the Political Forum. We are on. Today is November 19th, and before we start the event, I just want to introduce you to a very special guest that we have. We have Alma Cook, who is a singer and songwriter and an entrepreneur who hails from both a blue state and a red state. While working as a musician in Los Angeles in California, she also owns a business in the oil fields of Williston, North Dakota. This gives her an immense passion and gratitude for cross-partisan, cross-cultural friendships. Hello, Alma.
Hi, Thomas. Thanks for having me here.
Yes, and you're going to be playing a song for us. Before we begin, maybe you could tell us what that is and what inspired you to pick this particular song.
Sure. So I'm going to be playing America the Beautiful. I know that many of you will be familiar with that one. Yeah, my father always said when I was a little kid that this should actually be the country's national anthem. In his point of view, I mean, he might have meant that more from a music snob perspective. But as I've been, meditating on it for these past few weeks, it's really striking to me the power of this song because it's a prayer. It's a prayer for the country. It's a prayer for brotherhood. And I didn't digest it that way when I was a child, but given everything that's happened this year, it's put a new spin on it. So it's become very special to me. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, beautiful for heroes proved in liberating strife, who north and south their country loved, and mercy more than life. America, America, may God thy gold refine, till all success is nobleness and every gain divine. Oh, beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. Oh, America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown my good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea, and crown my good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
Thank you, Alma. And
Thanks, guys.
thanks for that powerful performance. And that really captures the essence of spirit of where we are right now, just 2 weeks away from the election. So before we start, I do have a question for you, Alma, which is in the intro, you had mentioned about the experiences in the blue and red states. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of your personal journey as you weave through these two areas?
Sure. So so I mentioned the singer-songwriter world and the oil and gas world, which is the places that I currently occupy. But that kind of bipartisan, cross-partisanship goes even back to my childhood. I mean, I come from a family in which my mother is very conservative and my father is very liberal. I went to a very conservative K through 12 school, but that school is situated in a very liberal city. So again, it was that chance to occupy those two worlds. And that has just kind of continued down the line in my life. And I've never been more grateful for that than I have been this year, because I listen to some of my friends, whether they're in California or they're in North Dakota, and they talk as if they don't know anybody else in the entire world personally who is on the quote unquote other team. And when you don't know anybody on the other team, it's very easy to turn them into a gimmick and a caricature and write them off as somebody you don't need to listen to or pay attention to or care about. But we know that that's not true, and we know that that's not what unity and brotherhood looks like. So I've been immensely grateful to be able to call brothers and sisters people who are on both the right and the left.
Okay, thanks. And you can find Alma's music on Spotify and iTunes. And you could also follow her on Twitter, where her handle is at Here Alma, ALMA, where she comments on the arts, politics, and culture. Thanks once again.
Thank you, Thomas.
All right, folks. Well, I guess we'll get started. As mentioned, today's November 19th, 16 days after the election day, 11 days after Joe Biden was declared to be the victor after he had garnered more than 270 electoral college votes. Yet the nation appears to be more divided and polarized than ever before. I'm sure some of you want to weigh in on the status of the recounts and these election lawsuits. Let's save that for next Tuesday, because we are going to have experts come in to talk about the status of where those election litigation stand. Tonight, we're going to talk more about some of the philosophical and systemic reasons why we are divided as a nation. So the format for tonight's discussion is our co-moderator, Matthew, and I will be talking about two books written by very influential authors, that being David French and Ezra Klein. They try to at least analyze some of the reasons why we are in a state of this political gridlock. And what we'll do is, for the discussion format, is Matthew and I will go over some of the key points from the book. And then after that, we will open it up to the audience. So if you do have questions, feel free to post them on the chat room, or just raise your hand using the app feature, and we'll try to get to your questions after we finish the first segment. So I guess, Matthew, the first question as we sit here today, how would you summarize like your overall state of being coming out of this election?
I guess the only word that comes to mind for me is a little bit exhausted. It's just been a bit of an onslaught of news coverage. I guess it's also coinciding with me finishing up law school applications, which was very busy in its own right. So I think the months of October and November were a bit of a whirlwind for me. So exhausted is the main descriptive word that comes to my mind.
In some respects, are you glad that this election season is somewhat over, or?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a weird in-between phase right now, where it seems like most of the country is certain that the election is over, but a fairly sizable minority of the country is seems quite certain that it's not over. So that's I think I'll probably be more concerned about this if we're still in this situation a month from now. But it is a pretty interesting period we're in right now, and I'm kind of looking forward to getting past it, to be completely honest.
Yeah, in some ways for me it was a bit anticlimactic because I thought there was going to be all kinds of chaos and confusion leading up to and including the election day, and it seemed like by and large it was somewhat stable and there weren't any like high profile incidents. I mean, sure, you could talk about certain irregularities, but it seemed like maybe that's a good indication that they were able to at least manage this election well, notwithstanding the pandemic.
Also, I think much of the media did a decent job at managing expectations. I'm probably as guilty as many of the other people of getting caught up in the election night enthusiasm of, as results are coming in or whatnot. But when you kind of step back and look at it, yes, the overall election was a little bit closer than most people thought it would have been, but how it played out was fairly in line with what I was expecting. Trump was going to be have a pretty strong showing in a lot of states the night of, and then as the days go on, you'll start having a blue, not a blue wave, maybe a blue trickle come in that would push Biden over the top. Of course, again, they thought it would be a little bit wider than it was, but I think I think the media did a better job than I think maybe some people are saying that they did in terms of managing expectations.
Yeah. One of the questions that I posted was, it seems like we're in a state of negative partisanship where people vote for someone that they don't want to see get elected versus a candidate that they support. Did you see any of that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I think, that just not even unique to this election. I think that's just kind of describing the state of politics in America as of late, certainly since 2016, I would say even earlier than that. But yeah, I mean, I live in Manhattan. I'm unaware of any conservatives that live near me. I'm also unaware of many raging Biden fans that live near me, but I am aware of how much everyone around me dislikes Trump. So I think that goes to show that the negative partisanship and negative polarization is alive and well.
Yeah, and that seems to be the theme of these two books. So why don't we get into these two books? And again, for those of you who are not familiar with these books, Ezra Klein wrote Why We're Polarized, and we had a book discussion on that back in July. So this is kind of like a repeat of that. And then there was also another book by the author David French. He's a conservative author and a lawyer, and he wrote a book called Divided We Fall, and he talks about how certain states might secede from the Union. And before we get into kind of the nuts and bolts of some of the themes that come out of the book, I just want to let the audience know, sometimes when you attend these discussions or panel forums after the election, they tend to have these like autopsy where they talk about what went right, what went wrong, who's up, who's down. That's really not what we're going to do today. We're not going to play pundits tonight, just because tonight we're going to talk more about some of the systemic gridlock that we have. So if I could make an analogy to like a car, tonight we're going to actually look at a car under the hood. And let's say this car keeps on going into a ditch every 4 years, and we're on the verge of having like a near, catastrophic near-death experience in these cars. So tonight, let's just stop the car, stop the engine, and look underneath the hood and try to diagnose the problem. That's what these two authors try to do. And there is a competing narrative as to how these two authors frame the issue. So I guess we'll start with Ezra's book first. What's your overall takeaway from how he characterizes the problem, Matthew?
So Ezra tries to view polarization as a systemic phenomenon. And he has dedicates a good portion, maybe 70 pages or so at the beginning of the book, talking about the historical reasons for how we got to a polarized state. I think maybe getting into the details of that is a little bit beyond the core scope of this conversation. As you said, we went into that in July, but basically, I mean, he talks about polarization as an amalgamation of the incentives of the media right now and how we all have different identities. And now, as of late, it just, again, for several historical reasons, our identities tend to stack on top of one another. So, for example, if you tell me your position on gun rights or gun control, you could probably guess with reasonable accuracy, what your positions on other hot topics are as well. And a core part of his book, he pushes, he kind of tries to push a thesis that all politics is identity politics, but importantly, he takes he doesn't make identity as much of a grand signifier as some people view it. I mean, he says, if you're a New Yorker, that's an identity. If you're a father or a son, those are identities too. And he looks through how, from political advertising, all the different ways in which people engage with politics, it usually, as of late, there's a lot of focus on activating and reinforcing those identities, because that leads to people feeling threatened or feeling more engaged with politics than they would otherwise be if it was just purely, I guess, engaging through a philosophical battle of ideas. I'm sure there's probably other huge parts of the book that are slipping my mind right now, Thomas.
Yeah, one interesting reference that he talks about. The book is very well researched, so even if you don't agree with Ezra's viewpoints, I would strongly recommend at least looking at the different references that he has. And there's this one research that he talks about, which I found to be very compelling. It's the psychologist by the name of Henry Tajfel. And Matthew, maybe you could summarize the findings of that Henry Tajfel experiment.
Sure. So maybe it's interesting to give a little bit of Henry Tajfel's background or what brought him to conducting that research. So I believe he was a Polish Jew who moved to France, I think for college in the 30s. Then when France was invaded by the Nazis, he was captured, and he was just thought to be, a captured Frenchman. And so he survived, but then after the war, when he came home, every single one in his immediate and extended families had been murdered. So he became kind of fascinated with this concept of identity. It was the simple identity of his family being Jewish that led to them being exterminated. And it was the simple false identity of his captors thinking that he was French that led to him surviving. So he wanted to design a series of experiments that they were designed to test, at what level do these, at what level of strong identities, a weak identity would be, oh, your favorite color is blue. A really strong identity might be, oh, you go to the same church. Like as you go through that scale from very weak identities to strong identities, at what point do those, does triggering those or threatening those identities start to affect how you reason? So he has a group of 64 young boys that are as part of a school on a field trip, and they come in and they tell them, okay, we're doing a little bit of an experiment. Up on the screen is a whole bunch of dots. So just guess, hand out pencil and paper, guess how many dots are on the screen. And we're just trying to do this experiment for research purposes. This whole experiment was just a charade. But then they said, oh, actually, we have this other experiment while you guys are here. Maybe we could just do this real quick. And as they move into doing the experiment they were actually interested in. So they divide the boys randomly into two different groups. They told them that one group was the boys who had underestimated the number of dots on the screen. They told the other group, you're the group of boys that had overestimated. Not that that's important or anything, but we'll just do it because it actually turned out to be half and half or close enough. And so it was, what he found was interesting is that this experiment was supposed to be the base level experiment, the lightest association of group identity possible. And then they would build up from there to then get a better idea of when does this start to kick in. But they never actually ended up doing further studies because at even this very light, weak sense of group identity started to impact how the boys behaved. So after they were divided into groups, whether it was one boy was allowed to assign, he was given a certain amount of money that he could divide amongst two other boys. They would tend towards dividing it evenly if both were in his group or both were out of his group. Once it came to one being in, one being out, they started to give it disproportionately to more than half to the member who was in their group. And there's a series of steps there, but I think when you go to the end of Ezra's pages on this research, it actually not only it goes to show how such a light sense of group identity can cause people to, like their group. He actually, it was a weak source of evidence for negative polarization. So in the event that, I forget exactly how they set it up, but basically, if I were to give money to, and I was dividing it amongst a member who was in my group and a member who was not in my group, I would actually choose, if I was given two different arrangements, I would be more likely to choose the one that maximized the disparity between the two rather than maximizing the amount of money that was given to my group member. So to make that more simple, I would be more likely to choose to give my group member $30 and the member not in my group $10 than I would be to give the member of my group, $100 and the member not in my group $90, because they were more likely to choose a higher disparity, 30 to 10, than a higher overall amount of money, 100 to 90. So it was, I guess that's basically the extent of that research, but it was such a, I guess, interesting piece of research that just shows something as meaningful as the number of dots on a screen would cause people to have such a in-group, out-group bias. And it's a fairly repeatable experiment as well. I think he cites a couple other examples.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway point from that experiment, which I found to be very compelling as far as the findings and the summary, is that if people are left to their devices, we tend to act in a very tribalistic way. Now, you can make an argument that, well, that's how we evolved over a century, so that's natural. Okay, and you can certainly cite, things like the Lord of the Flies, where you leave a group of young children on an island and they resort to all kinds of tribalistic hierarchy. There's also the Stanford experiment where people are basically exploiting each other based on their vulnerabilities. So that's human nature. I think what's interesting about this particular experiment from Henry Tajfel is that these dots on a circle, that means absolutely nothing. These are just symbolic things. These dots did not represent, per capita income or, the life expectancy. These are just simple dots. And I believe that our system is designed right now, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, where we are being divided based on these kind of artificial lines. And I'll just go through some examples. There are things like, the debt ceiling or certain tax policies. Yes, if you are a ferocious advocate of one of those issues, it's great that you should at least speak out. But by and large, these are not the issues that should be really dividing us. But according to the author, Ezra Klein, we live in a system where we are part of this very vicious system where the players who are involved in the system, that being the lawmakers, they are rewarded for these very extreme behaviors by taking a very polarized stances, and then we are just adding further fuel to the fire. And you can certainly go down the list where there are a lot of wedge issues that we talk about. Technically, they're not that big of a deal. Granted, there are some major issues that I think the left and the right do have disagreements about, and that's important. And it's good that we have differences, because we live in a free society where people get to air their differences and have grievances. But I think that artificial dot on the screen and how that divides people to resort to act in a very tribalistic way, I think kind of sums up this kind of zero-sum vicious nature of our politics, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, making no judgment on the topic of debt and deficits. I just feel like I constantly, when this topic comes up, think about how that was the rallying call for the right during the Obama years, and you hear nothing about it these past 4 years. And if I had to bet, I would bet that we'll probably be hearing more about debt and deficits in the coming 4 years when all of Biden's plans come up for a vote. So.
Yeah, but I mean, you could also say the same thing from the left too, because they
For
take
sure.
certain, again, I don't mean to minimize people's real grievances, because we're talking about real people, real lives, real issues, but some of these issues only affect a very small sliver of the electorate, but that gets consumed on the Senate floor. So then they start having these debates about these very narrow issues. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but I think the author David French will say sometimes these elections don't really like drastically change our society, meaning by choosing one president versus the other, it does not eliminate free speech, or it does not completely overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, the proponents or the advocates would like to make you think that it does, but I think it might maybe either shrink or kind of put some limitations on the outer parameters of these rights. But it's just the way how our system is, it's very unlikely that there's going to be like an overnight 180 on these policies. But at the same time, every election, we go into these election cycles as if our life depended on it. And it's like the end of the world if the outcome that we're expecting does not happen. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a overly negative focus when it comes to political coverage generally. I mean, a point that David French makes in his book is it's kind of interesting that after every election, in between every election, each side is totally convinced that they're losing the culture war. And then he just goes through and talks about how if you go from the mid 80s to today, there's been an incredible amount of growth in gun rights, and there's been an incredible amount of growth in LGBTQ rights too. So in important ways, each side has some very tangible, large wins that they could point to. But I guess that doesn't keep people, as glued to the cable news or whatnot as much as the negative coverage does. So we rarely take the time to sit back and reflect on the sides in which our side may actually be achieving things that are positive, as opposed to just preventing the other side from achieving their goals.
Right, and that's one of the commentaries from Ezra Klein's book, in the sense that once upon a time, media was not as polarized, but as these companies became more consolidated through mergers and acquisitions, and it took away from the kind of the local grassroots journalism into a more kind of a mainstream, money-making, clickbaiting type of scheme. We are left with sensational stories, and all it does is it just reinforces certain biases that we have, confirmation bias. So there's a whole chapter dedicated to how exploring how media just kind of adds further fuel to the fire.
Yeah, an interesting term he puts forward, which I think is a fairly common term now, is nut picking, which is, and I think actually not just media, but this is probably particularly pernicious in terms of social media, whereas people are incentivized to find an example of extremism on the other side and then hold that up as being representative of that whole side. If you see one or two or three instances of something, you could think, okay, this is one or two or three instances of something of a country of 330 million people, or perhaps it's indicative of thousands of instances of this, and we really have to be more concerned or overly concerned with these negative happenings than I guess reality would actually suggest. So that's I guess a bit of a social media manifestation of it, but it also happens in mainstream media as well, for sure. mean, a perfect example is the amount of time that was spent on the Covington Catholic incident, an incident that I would say was objectively not that important. It just happened to fit in with the political cleaves of, you look at these people wearing MAGA hats being so insulting, and yeah, I think we spend a lot, way too much time on these incidents.
Yeah, and I think that Covington incident is a perfect scenario of how we have this media ecosystem that just, it's driven by narratives. So again, for those of you who did not follow that story, there was, I think there were high school students visiting Washington, D.C., and one of the kids or some of the kids were wearing the red caps, MAGA hats, and there were I guess there was another group, I guess maybe they accosted them, and then they came across this Native American man, and he's banging his drums. Now, each media outlet kind of selectively edited certain portions to make it fit their narrative. So for instance, I think CNN was, I'm not sure if it's CNN or the Washington Post, but they were subject to the lawsuit for defamation because they only edited the clip that shows the kid just kind of smiling, kind of grinning at this Native American man wearing the Make America Great Again hat. So, what they do is, aha, see, you have a kid that disrespects person of color. And guess what? He's wearing a Donald Trump hat. So that's the narrative. And this is just yet another cherry-picked evidence to kind of fuel that narrative fire. On the other hand, the conservatives, led by Breitbart and others, saying, well, this is yet another infringement on our ability to be accurately represented in the media, and they're basically out to get us. Now we're the victims, and this just adds further insult to the injury. So that story, I think Matthew's right. It doesn't really have much of a public policy implications, other than, yes, it's a First Amendment case. But I think that kind of shows how these media operatives act in their own self-interest to further expand on their narratives. So speaking of media, there's a chapter in Ezra's book where he really talks about how our misunderstanding, so those who are on the red team, they have a complete misunderstanding of those on the blue team, and vice versa. And he's got very compelling statistics. I'll just give you some examples for the audience who have not read the book. For instance, Democrats, when they were polled, they believed that 44% of registered Republicans made more than $250,000. 44%, that's almost half. In reality, it's only 2% of registered Republicans earn more than $250,000. Also asked in a poll, Democrats believe that 40% of the registered Republicans were seniors, and it's only about 20 to 25%. On the other hand, when they poll tested the registered Republicans, they thought that 35% were member of the LGBT. So again, they thought 1/3 of every Democratic Party voter were an LGBT member of the community. In reality, it's only 6%. They also looked at the level of union membership. They thought about 40% to 45% were members of the union. It's only 20%. They thought about half of the voters in the Democratic Party were African Americans. In reality, it's about 25 to 30%. So again, this kind of shows why there's a fundamental misunderstanding. And when you only watch these kind of narrative-driven media outlets, then that further consolidates your misunderstanding and biases. So. All right, anything else on that, Matthew? What do you think? Okay.
No, I don't have anything to add to that.
All right, so there's another study that Ezra talks about in the book, and I think the other author, David French, also mentioned it too, which is the Kassenstein research on how within any group, when there is a lot of people that are kind of like interacting or associating, it kind of generates like the most extreme ideas. Do you know much about that research?
Not much, but yeah, it's I think a fairly academic law and economics paper, technically called The Law of Group Polarization, written in 1999 by University of Chicago law professor Cass Sunstein. And basically, I'm not as familiar with all of the mechanics of what experiments. I think it was largely an amalgamation of other research as well. But it talks about how, the big takeaway from the claim from the paper is that it's fairly academic. I think he uses the term a pre-deliberation tendency, which basically is just swap in for a bias. If you have a group of like-minded individuals who are all have a pre-deliberation tendency or a bias towards one way or the other on an issue, as they congregate in groups, they actually tend to radicalize each other and come out of that conversation with even more extreme positions than they had going into it, which is like at one point a very interesting grand claim, and at the other point it seems almost obvious now because it describes so much of society. I mean, do you think if you put a bunch of very far, like people that are very interested or intrigued by single payer healthcare, for example, do you think they're going to go into a group and have a conversation and come out less convinced of their position? No, they're going to be as convinced, or in most cases, even more convinced. And then there's another interesting part of the paper where they talk about how, well, I guess there's two interesting parts. One, they talk about how individuals are willing to forego their immediate senses to go along with the group, so long as it's in standing with their pre-deliberation tendency, which I guess in a way, this is kind of just an academic finding of peer pressure. It's examples of if you hold up a card and there's several different lines, choose which one is the longest, or something very simple like this. After 12 rounds of this, with one, I think it's basically like there's 12 people and one of them is the subject being tested. And then they'll go through 12 rounds where they all say, okay, this. They go down the line. Each person says which one they think is the longest. And then in some of the rounds, they'll have most of the people just point to one of the lines that is clearly not the longest. Like for the purpose of the studies, they're usually not very close to one another. They're kind of noticeable. And 70% of tested subjects in at least one round went with the group and picked the line that was like far and away clearly not the longest. And then I guess he uses that with some other bits of research to, I guess, I think the term he uses is cascades, which basically is, I guess to put it into slightly more colloquial language, you have some people that are, I guess, very open to this pre-deliberation tendency or biases, and they will, if just a few people point towards the line that is not the longest as being the longest, they'll go along with it. Okay, and you're not going to do that because you're trying to be grounded in your senses. But then as now say 3 or 4 people do it, there are some people that like, okay, well, I wasn't going to go along with the group when it was just 1 or 2 people, but okay, maybe I am wrong. Maybe I should doubt my senses. And then eventually, as it comes, as the number of people in the group get bigger and bigger and bigger, there are very few people that are willing to be that 1 or 2 individuals to just stand their ground and will not forego their immediate senses and just go with the group. So it's basically when you take the first part of the paper that talks about how people with like-minded individuals, when they congregate, they tend to come out with more extreme positions. With the cascading effect, that's kind of another academic finding that tends to support groups just becoming more extreme polarized over time.
Yeah, and I think those two effects, you can see that play out in real life in our political world, where in terms of the cascading effect, you have public pressure, and sometimes whether if you're a political actor or as voters, you have to give it to public pressure and not be able to stand up for certain principles. Yet on the other hand, we have what's called a primary system, where during any primary challenge, it's usually a candidate whose ideas are more, again, euphemistically, it's robust. But if you look at it within the spectrum of the Overton window, it's a very ideological kind of proposal that's almost out on its outer plank. That's the one that gets more attention, especially in districts where it's a very polarized or gerrymandered district, because that's what sells. Because any sense of just, boring, moderate positions sometimes don't garner headlines or grassroots following. So we're in a system where we are rewarding those who tend to outflank the other. And this happens on both sides. I mean, this is not a commentary on one side versus the other. You could sit around, you could have a bunch of, let's say, conservative, free market leaning people, and their debate's going to be, well, how much government can we shrink? Well, I bet you I could shrink more government programs than you can. And then it becomes this kind of a mental, wrestling match as to who could outdo the other. And likewise, you could see it on the other side, where the argument is about how generous a government program can be in subsidizing citizens or having a more generous programs. And it's going to be another intellectual exercise of who could outflank the other based on who could be a bit more bombastic in terms of the dollar amount. So that's kind of what we see playing out.
Purity tests, they sometimes call this too.
Yeah, litmus test. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so why don't we go into some of the ideas advanced by David French? And for those of you who are not familiar with David French, maybe Matthew, you could just kind of explain to us who he is and what he does.
Sure. David French, as Thomas mentioned, he's a lawyer. He went to Harvard Law in the early 90s. After that, I think he taught at Cornell. He was president of FIRE, which I believe stands for Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. It's a group that basically fights for free speech rights on college campuses. He also did a whole bunch of separate civil liberties litigation. He enlisted in the Army in 2005 or 2007 as a JAG officer to go over in Iraq. And when he came back, he became a pretty well-known writer for the National Review. And I believe a little over a year ago, maybe he left National Review to found the Dispatch, which is a new right of center news outlet.
Yeah, and what's interesting about his background is that, as Matthew mentioned, he was a military officer who was deployed to Iraq. Before he was deployed, he even admits that he was very a bitter partisan. He would make sure that he could win every argument intellectually against the liberals. And he almost made a passion of trying to criticize those who he considered to be his political opponents. But then once he was deployed to Iraq, well, hey, you have a country here, Iraq, where you have a very old tribals, tribal rivals. So you have the Sunnis and the Shias and the Kurds, and they are bitterly disputing over different ideas about the future of the country. Because again, the country was recently, I guess, overthrown with Saddam Hussein no longer at the helm. And what he observed is that they are really debating about real issues that affect the existence of their future. And he thought a lot of the arguments and debates that took place in the US tend to be a bit more shallow and petty. And he talks a lot about these kind of culture wars. On one hand, yes, they are very significant because it does affect those who are disenfranchised and those who are underrepresented. But on the other hand, every issue becomes like a wedge issue. So I think he understood what it is to at least understand the other side. And
yeah, he also talks a little bit, I guess he doesn't use this explicitly, but he kind of talks about negative polarization here as well, in the sense that, so he's talking about, yes, obviously the philosophical divide of Sunni and Shia Muslims goes back centuries, millennia, but that's not necessarily driving the day-to-day happenings in this culture war. It's always getting them back for the last thing they did to you, while they're trying to get you back for the last thing you did to them. And he said when he came back, he kind of just couldn't help but see how obvious that was in all our culture. And I think it's kind of supported by how parties can kind of flip-flop on issues, and much of the base goes with them, because it's not really about, again, for a lot of people it is, and even for most people it's probably about both of these, but I think people underestimate how much of it is really, it's kind of team sport. You're going along and supporting this idea or that idea. It's partially, sometimes in large part, due to the fact that it's your guys' position, and it's anti them. So I think that kind of like, it seems to be like, he doesn't say it explicitly, but it seems to be one of the incidents that kind of was the, I guess, the initial idea for this book, or I guess this whole general concept that he's writing about.
Yeah, and Matthew mentioned that David French is a lawyer, so he approaches analyzing a problem from the standpoint of the original framework of the country, which is the Bill of Rights. And he goes into like a very lengthy, elaborate discussion about how we have this system designed by the framers, the federalism, and he talks about how, well, if you could just maintain that and preserve it, then a lot of these issues that we are fighting over, whether if it's guns, abortions, same-sex marriage, go down the list, will tend to be resolved on a local level. So maybe Matthew, you could perhaps you could shed some light on his version of federalism, and in terms of how that could protect the Bill of Rights.
Sure. I'll step back a little bit, back to, he keeps going back to Federalist number 10, which is where James Madison's writing about the violence of faction. And he mentions this several times in the book, but the main takeaway is he goes back to this line, I forget exactly how it's worded, but it's basically, so long as men are free and able to reason, you will have them interested in different things, competing for different values and forming factions. So James Madison, I think, uses that as partial justification for the Federalist system, or the Federalist design of our government. And then David French basically uses that as, he thinks that's a pretty good idea, and it's something we've tended to move away from. As everyone's aware, the federal government is orders of magnitude more powerful today than the founders would have intended. And before he goes straight to, I guess, his ultimate conclusion, which is we should increase federalism, he has an intermediate pit stop where he talks about tolerance. And he says, basically, like, I guess it's a little pessimistic, but he says, like, our nation's only hope in some regards of not continuing to go down this path of further division and further polarization is to find a renewed sense of tolerance. But importantly, tolerance is tolerating people you don't like, or ideas that you don't like. He talks about this one, he references a couple times this one meeting that he had with other pundits, other thought leaders, I guess, in political movements. It's all unnamed because the whole purpose of the meeting allegedly was to have people from different sides of the ideological spectrum come together and talk about how, it seems like politics and discourse generally is getting more and more heated and very unhealthy for the country. And it seems like we're going down a path we all see we're going down, but there's nothing we can do to get off of it. And the topic of tolerance came up, and a whole bunch of people were talking about, okay, well, the left is really tolerant, the right is not. And he said, you can kind of just cut through that when you say, well, what's wrong with gay people? And they would all say, oh, well, nothing. What do you mean? And he's like, well, that's the point. Like, you can't claim to be tolerant when you don't think there's anything wrong with the actions or the beliefs that someone is taking or professing. Now, that's not to say anything about LGBT positions. But basically, he says that we need to grow more comfort. We need to let California be California and let Tennessee be Tennessee, is how he talks about it. And, you know, if we have an enhanced sense of tolerance, where, you know, you let people in their areas live in accordance with how, you know, the laws and customs that are enacted by their state and local governments, and then you can do the same where you live, then it could actually, that enhanced sense of, a renewed sense of tolerance is necessary for this increased federalism to be useful. Otherwise, federalism is just a tactic where the party out of power is for federalism because they don't want the party in power of the federal government to be ramrodding their positions for, and then that just flips whenever the party in power flips.
Right, and it seems like David French's kind of mantra is more about just keep government small and localize, more kind of strengthening of government systems.
Yeah, clearly a conservative at heart.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just trying to figure out how that would play out in practice, because I think his theory is basically, he keeps on saying we need to decentralize our national politics, meaning these you know, national players, the politicians, they don't need to play such a prominent role in our lives, and leave more power to the states, i.e. the 10th Amendment, which is part of the Bill of Rights. But I think one of the miscalculations or the unintended consequences when you leave to the devices of these states or regions, well, you're going to end up with regional factions, and you're going to have a system where certain regions may perpetuate their, I hate to use the word extremism, but it's like their culture that's different than another region. They're going to come into a conflict. And we saw that during the Civil War. So again, I'm not saying that this is going to lead to another civil war, but I tend to believe that that system will kind of perpetuate and reinforce certain biases and mainstreams that may not be acceptable in other parts of the country. Therefore, this idea of a national identity that we cherish may no longer be as pervasive.
Yeah. I agree with that. So I guess David French's whole book is saying that it could lead to a civil war. You know, he's not saying necessarily that this is going to happen in 5 or 10 or 15 years. I think he's mostly saying if these trends persist, you know, whether you want to go out 20 or 30 or 50 or 60 years, he says that that's kind of the only logical conclusion. But I guess one interesting part where I kind of feel like the argument he's putting forward tends to circle back on itself is, so he's saying that if we can you know, let California be California and let Tennessee and Texas do things their way, well, in the immediate short term, that would mean a much more progressive California and much more conservative, you know, Tennessee's and other red states. But when you combine that with, I guess, what we've said before about how, you know, the nature of mainstream or cable media and social media with nut picking and whatnot, it might just lead to even more extreme cases of like-minded individuals congregating in their areas, having more conservative policies be passed in areas where conservatives dominate through the law of group polarization. And the stuff that he's citing in this book tends to lead me to think that, okay, that would just possibly lead to further polarization. I don't necessarily see how it doesn't seem like a silver bullet to me necessarily. It seems like the research he uses in his own book to support his claims, I think you could probably say in some ways could lead to a very different conclusion than the one he ultimately comes to.
Yeah, I think at one point where I would agree with David French's proposal is that I think this might strengthen certain regionalism. What I mean by that is certain states might collaborate more because they have a shared interest based on the sheer nature of their geographical boundaries being next to one another. A perfect example of that is, I don't think David French mentions it in his book, but regards to climate change, certain northeastern states about 15 years ago, they entered into this regional greenhouse gas initiative. I think it's called RGGI. And basically the idea was, okay, if the central government, i.e. federal government, is not taking any action, then local governments are free to coalesce and collaborate on certain initiatives. Now, you can make an argument that, well, issues that are global in nature cannot be addressed by just 7 or 8 individual states. But I think at least that could be an example of how by having a more kind of decentralized federal government through the enforcement of federalism, you could have more collaborations like that. Because some states, by nature, they just have to collaborate. That's, they're living next to one another. So
I agree.
Okay. So now, for those of you who have not read the Federalist Papers number 10, the link was posted on our Meetup page, and it's really worthy to look at because I don't think the appreciation of the framers of the Constitution, it's not really a left or right thing, because I know that certain segments of the electorate tends to kind of glorify the framers, which I think, they were very flawed individuals, but their vision is pretty incredible. And I think the Federalist Paper number 10 certainly illustrates that. And what it shows is that this idea of direct democracy just will not work, especially a nation as diverse as ours, both in terms of the geographic reach, the demographics, the landmass. It just does not work. And you don't want to be in the minority where your voice is not heard because it's overtaken by the tyranny of majority. And one of the wisdoms that the framers had was that, they had studied a lot of the ancient history, the Greco-Roman history, and they know that having too much power in the hands of one entity corrupts. That's just human nature. And they were rightfully very skeptical about certain fallacies and certain vulnerabilities of human beings when they had too much power. So what Federalist Paper number 10 shows is that there has to be some balance. And the balance is you have a majoritarian rule by like a system of a representative form of government. At the same time, those who are in the minority are not completely shut out. But again, that argument sounds well and good in theory, but then when it gets interpreted, sometimes it does lead to some very, extreme outcomes. If I may, I'll just mention one scenario, and I know this is kind of outside of our discussion, but when the Citizens United case was handed down, Justice Scalia said, yeah, the framers said we need to have, we need to guarantee certain liberties. And if you place a restriction on our liberties, then that will corrupt our system. And the idea behind the Citizens United opinion is that making endless contributions to super PACs should be permissible because, again, it's our expression of free speech. So, sometimes, these kind of interpretations, whether if you agree or not, it tends to result in a very radical type of outcome. I think David French will also say that when it comes to issues like guns and abortion, it's better left to the states. And he always cites the late Justice Ginsburg, because even Justice Ginsburg thought that reproductive rights should be left to the states. But once you federalize it, or once you permit it on the national level, then you're going to have opposition from different corners of the country. And that's a very divisive measure. So, all right. Anything else on David French before we move on?
No, I was just going to ask you what your views are. So I guess the other thing you put in the group right after the Federalist number 10 was the podcast episode between Ezra and David. And so we just talked about David's proposed solution, which is enhanced federalism. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Ezra, where his solution is elimination of the filibuster. So allowing allowing it majorities in the federal government to have an easier time governing and then being judged accordingly, as opposed to this party saying when we get in power, we're going to do this. The out of power party, assuming the in power party doesn't have a 60 vote majority in the Senate, effectively just railroading and blocking that. And then you come to the next election where you're not really voting on what the party in power did or didn't do. So what are your thoughts on his proposed solution of the elimination of the filibuster?
So this might be shocking to some of you, but I don't support eliminating the filibuster. Now you can say, well, that leads to further gridlock. The truth of the matter is, again, my kind of interpretation of the framers' intent in terms of the checks and balances and balance of power is that things were meant to move on a very glacial level in Congress. It was intended to be a body where you really deliberate these issues and for them to be some grand compromise, for lack of a better word. So I believe just getting rid of the filibuster, it tends to be a very short-term gain for the party that's kind of out of power. But the party that's in power, it doesn't work out very well. And it seems like a lot of these topics tend to be heavily partisan, and it's usually based on like who's in power versus who's out of power. And I hate to be so cynical, but I do realize that, you know, this idea of, let's say, I'm sorry to get off topic, but I think this is very apropos, which is abolishing the Electoral College. Again, when President Obama won the election, no one talked about abolishing the Electoral College. It's only when you lose, then there's outcry. And look, we live in a society where we could petition and seek redress, but I think when you, the timing of it, when you bring up these issues, when you're out of power, it just seems like, some degree of like a buyer's remorse. And you're just trying to find any way whatsoever to win, even though if you are not taking a very principled position.
Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we bring the audience in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just go back to Ezra's book, because I did find his book to be very compelling. And just one thing I want to go back to is his book doesn't really talk about individuals as much. I mean, you would think a book that's about how polarized we are, he would pick all these, very toxic, divisive figures, but he's talking more about on the institutional level. So again, we have the system, the media, the lobbyists, the legislative body, and they're all working in concert. And the system that we have is so toxic and corrupt that their ill behavior is further rewarded every time when they do it. So again, I want to go back to the analogy that I used about the broken car. Again, if we were to look underneath the hood, you would expect to find a car with all these broken engines and things that, missing a screw and things that are in a dire repair. Well, according to Ezra Klein's book, it turns out that it's not. It appears to be broken because it keeps on going into the ditch, i.e., not being able to pass the debt ceiling, so we end up in default or near default. But it turns out when you look underneath the hood, each compartment actually works pretty well. It's working the way it's intended to work. It's just that they're not working in conjunction with other components of the car, and that's why it's not working. So I think that's really Ezra Klein's kind of takeaway, is that it's not broken in a sense that it's massively stayed caught in a state of gridlock. It's actually working somewhat in a way that exists in the worst form of human behavior and motivation. And again, the root word of politics, Paul, is about power. And it's all about people wanting to have power. So that's really at the root of what we have right now. So that's kind of my takeaway from Ezra's book. I'll certainly share some other insights later on, as far as Matthew and I will talk about some of, I guess, what are some of the solutions to the current state of divisiveness, but we're going to save that to the end. But for now, why don't we open it up to the audience, and feel free to chime in. Just raise your hands, and hopefully it's a question, but certainly you could, set up the questions. So tell us what the premise of the question is. So let's first go with James. So James, then Pete.
Thank you very much. Three very quick things. The primary system, do you not feel that that encourages polarization? Because at least in my district, very few people turn up for the primaries, so you get the most extreme candidates. Secondly, I think it's important to remember, and do you agree, that actually the nation is not as polarized as it used to be. I mean, there's huge progress in civil rights, and so the thing is, in Ezra Klein's book, I realize he covers this. It's because the parties have changed. The parties are now internally consistent with their views, and they didn't used to be. Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. And finally, perhaps more controversially, I think the reason why American politics is polarized to an extent is that we're not going to be able to change this, but the head of the government and the head of the state are the same person. So all the pomp and circumstance goes to the president, wherein European democracies, for example, it doesn't. There's a head of state that gets all the pomp and circumstance, and the politicians are basically don't have all that. And in fact, you can see how people interview on television in Europe, that they really ram at these heads of government in a way that would be not stood for here. So don't you think that is also a thing? So the primary system, isn't the country actually a bit more unified? And how can you get the pomp and circumstance out of this?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said about the primary system. I mean, I guess it's a little interesting we made it this far in this talk without discussing gerrymandering, which is another fairly depressing topic, knowing that I think just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court basically threw out a case saying that's a political question. So never bring another gerrymandering case before the Supreme Court again. So, I mean, I think it might actually be, I can't remember. It's some study I read on 538. I think it might be a majority of House districts where the greater threat is in their primary, and whoever wins the primary because of their gerrymandered districts is going to walk to a victory in the general election. So you have Republicans racing to the right, and that's how people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a devout, open QAnon supporter, makes her way to the House of Representatives. And on the left, you have people just rushing to the left. So yeah, I definitely think the primary system is an important part in this system that is leading towards polarization.
If I could speak on primaries, I think it's good for democracy. It's healthy. Now, certainly gerrymandering kind of fuels extremism. But I think all else being equal, you want there to be competition. To me, I think that's no different than, when you have many, as consumers, again, voters are consumers and we want to have choices. And if you have a career politician who is in a very comfortable seat and he or she doesn't make any changes, then I think they are underserving their constituents. So in a healthy, vibrant democracy, you want the primary system. Now, the problem, I think, it's twofold. I'm agreeing with Matthew in part and not agreeing on the other part, is that having these very gerrymandered districts, which I do believe that Supreme Court should have made a ruling on, but they did not. but they tend to foster more kind of extremist candidates. And the second part is some degree of reasonable campaign finance reforms, because sometimes money will really shut out the other opponents, and money will just buy you the election, at least in the primaries, maybe not necessarily in the general elections, but you've seen even in Manhattan or New York City throughout, you've seen a lot of these candidates come out of nowhere with very well-funded campaigns, and they do well in the primary. So that's what I'm kind of cautious about. Going to your second question about how back in the day we were very polarized, but are we still polarized? I think the author does talk about that being Ezra Klein. Yeah, he talks about how in the 1960s there were very high-profile political assassinations. Malcolm X, Dr. King, Bobby Kennedy. You go down the list, and you also had a lot of political violence that was fueled by the anti-war movements. Are we seeing a similar violence? That depends on who you ask. Again, that depends on how you get your news, because when you watch, if you gather news from, let's say, right of center, they tend to perpetuate these stories about how there's protests and riots across the country, but not so much on the left. So I think that really depends on how you look at it. But also, I think social media is certainly kind of amping up these kind of isolated incidents to the nth degree. So I don't think we're as violent as these days, but at the same time, I do see reports from the FBI saying that hate crime is at all-time high. So those two things cannot coexist. One has to be true, the other one is not. But at least we have not seen like high-profile assassinations. And again, Ezra Klein's book, he'll go back to 1800s, where they'll engage in a dueling match if they disagree with their political opponents. And Alexander Hamilton is a perfect example of falling as a victim to a political disagreement. The third question you had was, it seemed like you're alluding to, well, why isn't America a parliamentary state? It seems like that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
No, I'm not getting at that, but it's the fact that the president is so revered as a head of state, I think gets in the way of people having real interviews with him. And he doesn't, it's not just Trump. Before, everybody seems to be so delicate when talking to the president. You don't get out the same anger that you get in European and other democracies, where the head of state is a different person.
Sure, I'll speak to that. Unlike other European nations, if that's what you're comparing it to, we don't have a monarchy, we have a republic. Right. So, we don't have the Queen hanging out in the Buckingham Palace drinking tea all day. We have the head of state being the commander-in-chief. So I think this kind of goes back to human nature. We do live in a very kind of patriarchal society where we look up to the leader. And let's face it, the 45 presidents that we've had, they're all men. So we look up to that person, a male figure, to be kind of the moral authority of the country. And that's always been the case. And you could say that could be a good thing. I mean, after all, we went through some of the darkest times during the Great Depression, World War II, Civil War. And I think the nation looked up to these folks to rise to the challenge. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily a bad thing. But do we glorify these individuals? I'm not sure, because every president will say that they were treated very harshly by the press corps. So be that as it may, there's different accounts of how they're revered. But I think overall, we want the press corps, we want the public to be critical of the leaders. I mean, what's the opposite? Yeah. It's North Korea, where every household, they have to put up a portrait of the dear leader in every household. And that's certainly not a free society. There's certainly no tolerance there. So, all right, let's go to some other questions. I see a handout from Pete, then Ralph. Go ahead, Pete.
Hey, hey everyone. I have well, two questions that maybe you want to take a little bit later, so on solutions, but I just want to throw them out there. One is, we were talking about primaries, like what solutions or changes do you see to the way that we conduct elections, like top 2 primaries or ranked choice voting? Do you think any of these things could be helpful? And then the second question also on solutions, do you see any solutions from like how other countries, I just think of Germany in particular, doesn't seem to have quite the degree of polarization. Maybe that's a little bit of just what gets filtered through to me, but I'm curious if like other countries seem to have less polarization, or there's solutions that we could be porting over here. And so maybe you want to take those 2 questions later on. But the third thing that I'd want to bring up would be around, I think it's interesting, I think we were talking a lot, like polarization earlier in American history was much around almost like usually around a particular issue, right? Whereas today it's really around like all issues people have kind of sorted into. Yet actually, if you like look at the country, like people, actually do fit into like kind of all 4 quadrants in terms of their ideological views when they actually say, what they care about. And so is there like is it like the political parties are missing like an opportunity? Is there like an actual opportunity there for, socially conservative, economically liberal, or socially liberal, economically conservative candidates in certain areas or certain places? And is that like kind of a, why, I guess, like why would that be why are those people getting overlooked?
I mean, my knee-jerk response is maybe it's a bit of preference falsification going on. So preference falsification, I mean, that's part of it, I think. Preference falsification is a phenomenon where you ask someone a question and their professed belief, it differs from their actual belief, often without them even knowing it. So I guess I'm kind of thinking about this because I'm thinking about how it fits with the theses of these books, which in many ways always points towards negative polarization. I think people think that they have a strong this group, I'm sure, is self-selecting towards people that do actually have fairly strong groundings in their political leanings. But I feel like a lot of people, they think they feel this way or that way on an issue, but when it comes down to it and comes to voting, they negative polarization just really kicks in, and it just comes down to which side irritates them more, which side they're more upset with in the moment. I think that's actually a big part of it, to be completely honest.
And also one thing that Ezra Klein talks about in his book is that it's only recently, in maybe like the 1950s or 60s, that the 2 parties got really sorted out. Before the 60s, it was really hard to tell if somebody was a Democrat versus a Republican. I mean, sure, if someone's from the South, okay, they're probably a Dixiecrat, and chances are somebody from the New England could be a more moderate Republican. But Ezra talks about in 1950, I believe, there was a memorandum that was published by the American Society for Political Institute, I believe that's called. And basically he said, look, you 2 parties are too similar. You need to distinguish yourselves. One party needs to stand for X and the other party needs to stand for Y. And X and Y have to be very polar opposite. And they were begging for diversity of views. Again, that sounds good in theory, but then when you have a system due to this kind of vicious cycle that we get into where certain bad behavior is rewarded, then you have a very polarized view that don't really represent the true needs of the constituents. So I think that's the problem that we have. Maybe having more parties is a good thing, but right now that's the system that we have. And one last thing I'll point out is that the quadrant that Pete had mentioned, maybe some people belong in socially liberal but fiscally conservative versus fiscally liberal, socially fiscally liberal, socially conservative corner. That could certainly exist, but I think a lot of voters tend to be single issue voters. So what really animates them are issues that they could gravitate to. And at the core of Ezra's book is that we are all identitarians, meaning we all have certain identity leanings. Maybe we do it subconsciously, right? Maybe we only identify ourselves based on certain preferences or interests, and that's who we want to be associated with. And I think politicians do a very good job trying to appeal to those emotions. So again, if you're a pro-life person, that's all you think about, and that's how your identity is built. You may not do that consciously, but the way how the system is set up, they give you the news in that fashion, so that's all you receive, and that further confirms your biases. And again, I'm just using. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, he brought up ranked choice voting, which I don't necessarily think ranked choice voting is some silver bullet, and you implement it in 2024, and within a few election cycles, you're gonna see a third-party candidate, a third party ascending to the White House or having any meaningful representation in the Senate. But what I do think it could do is, I think it could possibly have a meaningful change on how politicians go about campaigning. So Pete mentioned those two quadrants that you were just talking about. And why did those people get underserved? And I think the answer is just because there's no need to serve to them. You don't have to. You can tell people what you stand for and increase the number of people that rally behind that message, or you can just convince them not to vote for the other guy. I mean, pretty explicitly in 2016, I don't remember the exact words he used, but it was very Donald Trump, in very similar words, said, African Americans, vote for me. Look at you, look at your lives. You've been voting for Democrats. What do you have to lose? And that's his pitch for African American voters. That's no meaningful attempt at thinking deeply about issues affecting the African American community, then putting that into some cohesive platform and trying to advocate for it. That's just saying, hey, look around. Anything you don't like, well, why don't you roll the dice on me, because I'm not that guy. So I don't know. I think ranked choice voting could. I think it could possibly have a meaningful impact on the health of our political discourse, in terms of not overnight, but slightly tweaking people towards more positive campaigning than negative campaigning.
Let's go to the next question. Ralph?
Yeah, thanks. My thought, I want to get back to the filibuster question. My thought about the filibuster is, especially in this time when there's so much polarization between the parties, it's really hard to get a consensus of 60 votes for a particular bill. And so my thought is that maybe a nice compromise idea would be to lower the filibuster threshold to 55 votes. So I offer that for better or worse.
I'll figure out what I'm thinking of and post it in the group on the meetup page afterward. But I have heard some proposal, again, forgetting who even put it forth, but they had some plan where after 3 failed votes, the threshold of a filibuster would decrease by 2, and then that would continually happening. That I think this was being pushed by someone prominently. I'm not sure what, but that's what I offer in response back to you, Ralph. I don't have too many more thoughts on it beyond that. But I agree. I mean, a 60 vote threshold is not super common.
And just one thing I'll add to the question is, I mean, the filibuster is kind of a creature of the Senate. I mean, it's not in the Constitution. And it was just kind of one of those rules that got adopted due to convenience. I believe at one point it was called something like a motion for reconsider, I think, or refresh. And basically they wanted to take a pause on any movement of any bill to move forward. So, I mean, there's no, it's not written in stone. And if somebody wanted to change it or modify it, that's certainly, something they could look at. Looks like there's some comments about, well, why not just do a simple majority? Well, I mean, again, that depends on who's in power, because what if, let's say, the Senate comes in next term as a GOP majority, and they say, well, guess what, guys? We're going to give more tax cuts, extend the Trump tax cuts. I'm sure those across the aisle will certainly not be, in favor of that. So it really depends on the issue and who's in power.
Thomas,
but-
Thomas, isn't it true that a filibuster rule can be changed rather easily, just as, under what's his name, Reid, when he was majority leader, he dropped the filibuster requirement for
Federal appointments,
federal
not including the
judges.
Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And then the Republicans did it extended it to the Supreme Court.
Right. So it's a question of voting on rules of the Senate, right? So you just need a simple majority for that.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's right.
But I'm suggesting a compromise, since doing away with the filibuster altogether seems to be, I don't know, maybe a radical idea. I mean, I wouldn't mind it actually, but I could see where requiring more than a simple majority is a good idea. I just think that 60 votes is way too high, and I think 55 is a nice number.
Yeah, and I mean, they could certainly amend the rules. It's a matter of having legitimacy. So again, if you want to have the appearance of legitimacy in the court of public opinion, well, you have to do it at a time when it seems like you're not simply, quote, rigging it to your own partisan advantage. So will a party in power now say, well, we're going to, change the rules to benefit the other side? That's highly unlikely, because I think that kind of goes to the core of one of the authors who talks about the zero-sum nature of Congress. So even little battles that they could win here and there, they're trying to gain that advantage. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So anyway, let's go to some other questions. Let's see, Amber, then Sandy. Amber?
Hi. I really liked yours and Matt's interpretations of both the book and what Ezra was saying. But I have this like fanciful idea, so I just want to ask this as a question to see if it could help with how partisan the country is. For me, I feel like it's the way politics has pretty much infiltrated the society, where politicians used to be friends. So Republicans and Democrats used to be friends. They used to argue in public, but behind the scenes they were all like good buddies. So it was really us they were playing to pit against each other. And now it's gotten so volatile. I just don't see how we can make our way back, because there's just a lot of fundamental things that we just have differences of opinion on. It's not like little things anymore. So that being said, there was something that Hillary Clinton suggested back in, I think it was like 2015, and she got laughed out of town for it, so she never repeated it again. But it's stuck in my head, where people could, like, if there's an issue, let's say there's during a presidency, everyone wants to know what the president should do first that year, or what their senator should focus on that year. So there would be a poll sent out, and everyone takes the poll and they say, okay, well, we want you to focus on the economy this year, or we want you to focus on climate change or whatever. And everyone takes the poll, and based on the national poll, that is what Congress or the president that's their directive and what they're going to work on. But not necessarily sending it out to people to discuss what the solution is, but what exactly it is that they want to focus on. So I think if you involve people more, then they will feel more a part of the government, and they won't feel like, oh, I didn't get this, or I'm a loser, or this person is getting preference over me and stuff like that. When everyone seems to be involved, I think that would be better. But what do you think?
I'm not entirely sure I understood the question, but my understanding is, I think it was very clear when Obama became president that he wanted to do healthcare, and that's what all the talk was around. I mean, that's just the nature of the bully pulpit. I mean, when the president repeatedly talks about a singular policy area, I mean, it's quite clear that that's the main focus in terms of their legislative goals. But I don't mean to sidestep the question. I don't understand, I guess, necessarily what Clinton might have meant by saying that they should put like a more formalized agenda. Or Thomas, did you understand it? Maybe I just misunderstood it.
Well, oh, sorry, let me clarify. So what she had said at the time was get people more involved in the decision making of the legislation process. So if there's a bill on the floor about, I don't know, the price of spilt milk tax or something, and now there will be an email sent out to all, people who are eligible to vote. Hey, do you want a tax on spilled milk? And they say yes, or they say no, and then their representative goes according to what that poll says.
Oh, got it. So more like legislation through referendum sounds like the proposal.
So in theory, that sounds great because you get the citizenry involved and engaged. But the dangers of that is how do you frame the question? And the framing of it could be very misconstruing. So again, let's take healthcare. President Obama's first, I guess, initiative and accomplishment was Obamacare. But that issue in and of itself could be framed as, well, do you want to, on one hand, it could be framed as, do you want to, get rid of Medicaid for your grandma, throw your grandma off the cliff, right? Remember those commercials? Or the other, way to frame the question is, well, do you want, quote, a socialist takeover of government healthcare? So it's really depending on how you frame the question. And people, the pollsters and those who issue those questionnaires could certainly frame it in a way that's very one-sided and not the most representative. I would rather be in favor of every elected officials having more town halls as much as possible. Go reach out to the communities, especially those that are underserved, and listen to them. So I think that's probably a better way to do it. Because, quite frankly, once you become an incumbent, you're kind of out of touch. And the only time when you are active is when you're up for re-election because you need to raise money. So I'd rather much see them being more engaged in a community in that sense than simply, just relying on surveys. And by the way, they do that all the time. Every campaign, they have pollsters that show, okay, well, this issue is popular versus that issue is not. So, that's constant.
It's not exactly that good, especially since we've seen that this year and in 2016. So people change their mind really, really quickly. And as you brought up, they can, also be swayed based on how you frame the question. But yeah, I get it. I just think that if people were more involved, then they feel like they have more control of the system. But town halls, like I knew one, we had a representative came every 2 years to do a town hall, and people would yell at him, send him emails, all this type of thing, but he just kept getting voted back in. He was there almost until he was in retirement age. So mostly because people like name recognition, but that was just an idea I threw out there.
Yeah, but Amber, if your question is when an incoming president has certain degree of political wind at his or her back, there's some mandate. Why can't they then push through their top priorities? That's a valid question. But unfortunately, we are in a system where the party out of power, they will do everything it takes to put the brakes on, come to a grinding halt. Again, this happens both sides. 2008, when President Obama came in, there was a famous dinner gathering with Mitch McConnell and other power brokers. And basically, they took a vow that we're going to make President Obama a one-term president. Likewise, with when President Trump came in, it was pretty obvious that they're going to go with impeachment, just a matter of what do we impeach him for. So it seems like they were just completely motivated by impeachment and Russiagate and trying to undermine the presidency. So again, whether if you think that's valid or not, that really depends on your partisan leanings. But I think we are in a system where this idea of a grand bargain, grand compromise. I think those days are kind of gone. Just going back to the healthcare, I mean, people love to criticize Obamacare, and that's perfectly fine, but there's really nothing radical. If you look at what kind of Obama tried to do in terms of getting the cross-party appeal, and people forget that Obamacare is really a heritage, the Heritage Foundation healthcare plan, because it has the individual mandate. And back in the 90s, people are all very bombastic about individual responsibility, because that's what you needed to do. And then Mitt Romney adopted it, and that was praised as kind of like a silver bullet for the healthcare initiative. And then now all of a sudden people equated with like a socialist takeover. So I think in some ways we're in a very dysfunctional system, coupled with the media ecosystem that kind of fuels this kind of frenzy. So in order to tamp that down, there are things that we can do. But I think for the purpose of the question that Amber just presented out there, it's more of an explanation why certain things cannot get done. And I'll just conclude by saying that Biden's going to come in. He's going to have his initiative or his mandate, but ultimately I'm not sure if anything's going to get done. This assumes that it's going to be a split government where you have Republican-controlled Senate, Democrats with a very narrow majority in the House. I'm just not sure if there's any room other than maybe like a stimulus package in response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was looking for really quickly. It's just like something that the president has as a mandate that, hey, look, see, we did this poll. Everyone says they want to do this, or jury said they want to do this. It's beyond me. It's more than just me, the person. This is what the people want, because I'm always hearing about, oh, well, the poll says that 70% of Americans want this, but it's not even put as a vote, or a bill is not even made to even address it. But that was me. You can move on to someone else.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, everyone is self-interested in staying in power. So I don't think they're going to do something that will hurt their chances of being reelected. I'm sure right now, Team Biden is thinking about, well, how can we fight off the midterm election that's coming up? So I really don't think they're motivated by, let's hear the will of the people. They're just, interested in consolidating power. And that's just the reality. Okay, let's go with, let's see, Sandy and then Colleen. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, just trying to think of some things that might help to tone down some of the polarization. So there's some countries like Australia where voting is mandatory. So every adult has to vote. You actually get fined if you don't vote. And they try to make it easy. They do it on a Saturday. It's kind of like a national holiday there. And that's kind of nice because it really gets everybody involved. Because here in America, voter participation is pretty low. And the people who do show up to vote are those who are a little more politically active and probably more polarized. And often what the parties do here to try to turn out the vote is to really rile up their bases based on, polarizing points. So, and I think both sides do it. So that helps to drive the polarization in this country, just the fact that not everyone votes and we have low voter turnout. So if we had a system like Australia or various other European countries where everyone was just required to vote, then there wouldn't be that incentive to polarize and drive out your base. And in fact, you wouldn't only be appealing to your base, you'd have to appeal to the majority of voters to get elected. So, Australia has kind of talked about how this helps to inoculate them against a candidate like Trump, because, it's not as polarized and you don't have, as much extremism there. So that's kind of a nice system, I think. What do you think of that?
Well, I'll go first. It seems like with mandatory voting, it's one of those things, again, it sounds great. Why not enhance civic participation? But I think the reality is you have many people who just don't have the energy to keep up with all the ins and outs of the policies and who's running. So it's going to come down to a battle of name recognition. Those whose names resonate, then that's who they'll vote for. So I think in some ways it will be, I guess, it'll increase the level of democratic participation, but it doesn't truly reflect the will of the people. And people will just simply check off names that sound good. It's usually the incumbents, since they know the incumbents, who the incumbents are. So I think this might actually be a disincentive or disadvantage any challengers who are trying to unseat the incumbent. What do you think, Matthew?
Yeah, I don't know how I feel necessarily about mandating voting. I guess what's interesting is we actually have high voter turnout among registered voters. So that tends to be in the upper 80s or I think like 85 to 90%. And just bringing it back to part of what Ezra talks about in his book, he talks about the fracturing of the media ecosystem, basically talking about, you know, we used to have Walter Cronkite as like one of like 3 evening news hosts where everybody was getting a similar stream of information. And people thought that with the .com boom and just the rise of websites and all these specialized interest sources of information, that everybody would become so much more informed because you could so easily get more information on exactly what you're interested in. But what really happened is political junkies, like presumably most of us, become hyper informed. And now that there's so many other options to distract oneself through Netflix and whatnot, the people who are not political junkies actually have tended to become less informed than they used to be several decades ago. And now that's neither here nor there. I'm not casting any judgment on that, but I maybe it's a little paternalistic, but I don't necessarily feel excited with mandating people vote if those people never engage in any sort of political interest in those 4 years between elections. I don't have a problem with them voting. I don't necessarily see that as being a silver bullet or leading to some ideal outcome. Yeah, so I have pretty muddled thoughts on it, but I guess that's what I think.
If I could just add one more point to it. I think in a free society, you want to make voting as exciting as possible. You want to entice the voters. You want them to come out. You want them to put that date on the calendar, circle it. And why do we lack the enthusiasm? Because quite frankly, we don't have good ideas coming from these candidates. And I'll just give you a case in point. If a candidate ran and say, I'm going to legalize all illegal substances, legalize marijuana, I'll almost guarantee you that voter turnout will triple. Just like if you guarantee that maybe the gas prices will go down or there's going to be increase in certain living standards, make policy proposals that are very captivating, especially to young voters, first-time voters, because a lot of people who are kind of looking at what happens in a public policy arena from the sidelines is that they don't find this to be very attractive. They think it's a very boring, just kind of posturing. And their mindset is, well, my vote doesn't count anyway, so who cares? But if you have a candidate who runs on like a very populist message, it's not necessarily a right versus left thing. It's just to serve the constituents. What do the people want? And I'm almost convinced that if they ran on those populist ideas, people will turn out. Now, of course, there's dangers to that too, because what if the populist idea tends to be very extreme? Well, I mean, that's kind of the dangers of democracy. And certainly the Federalist Papers, number 10, and David French and others talk about some of the safeguards to make sure that we don't resort to those extremes. But I think, even in 2020, this election, you didn't really hear a lot of ideas being proposed. It was more about, I'm not the other person, so vote for me so that the other person doesn't get in. Again, that negative partisanship really outweighs any robust ideas.
I just want to clarify, prevent my semi-paternalistic answer from coming across as an overly paternalistic answer. I do think we should be making it much easier to vote. I do think it would make sense to have a holiday, federal national election holiday. I think increased mail-in voting makes it much easier for people to vote. And all those measures seem to make sense to me. I think if you're forcing the pen in someone's hand, it does seem like it might just be a popularity contest at that point, or like all elections are popularity contests, but a name ID contest at that point. So I think we should, it's important to make. I think voting should be easier in this country, but I don't know if it should be compelled. That's all.
Yeah, I second that. Let's just get rid of all the barriers to voting. And, I mean, there are so many districts where, people are disenfranchised, where voting is a huge obstacle. It's like you got to take a day off just to go vote. And to me, that's nonsense. But at the same time, to underscore Matthew's point, people will only do if they're motivated. And once you make it a compulsory act, then it kind of takes away the motivation and it becomes more of a chore. And I just don't think that's healthy for a system to truly reflect what the will of the people is. All right, let's go with Colleen. Go ahead, Colleen.
Okay, we apparently consider the divide a bad thing. We are talking about the divide, and I want to go back to social experiments that explain the divide. The books rely on social experience to drive conclusions, and I just want to follow up on the experiments you mentioned and the solutions some of them offer for the resolve of the divide. One of the experiments you mentioned, I believe, Thomas, you mentioned it, was the Robert's cave experiment, which was about the intergroup conflict and resolution. So following the conclusion of that experiment, when we have connections which are already built between people, which result into a group identification, the only way to overcome that limiting identification is not by participating in joint activities with the opposite party, but when all parties are facing common problem or common threat. So I have three questions in that regard. We have the example of the 2016 presidential elections, in which significant portion of the supporters of Bernie Sanders did not vote for Hillary Clinton or were blamed for partially for her loss, despite the democratic presentation of Trump as a common threat then. However, now in the 2020 elections, we can see how this was resolved. I'm talking about the conflicts of internal groups into the Democratic Party for sure. So my question is, do we need an enemy to resolve the divide? And in absence of an enemy, of real enemy, to create and vilify somebody or some country or whatever? And this is my first question. I will give you the three all together. The next question is more like a follow-up of the first one. If the answer is yes, that in order to resolve the divide, we need an enemy, what should be an enemy, considering that we are now in a COVID pandemic, and obviously it is not serving the role of a common enemy, because I believe you have recognized at the beginning of the meeting that Democrats and conservatives are operating on different facts and realities. So COVID is not working, obviously. And my third question, which I consider more important, is there really a necessity to resolve the divide, or we are talking about how to change the political system so it works, it is not blocked, it is not in a gridlock, but we are not actually, we have to leave the divide present and existing. We are not actually trying to resolve it.
Well, I guess I'll take the third question. That seems the easiest to respond to me, because I mean, quite explicitly in David French's book, he says, no, we shouldn't try. I mean, this is, I think, one of the reasons he does, 4 or 5 different instances cite Federalist number 10. He basically says it's unrealistic to think you could resolve this divide. It'll get bigger. It could be bigger. It could be smaller. So I mean, his solution, which not to say it's the right solution, but his solution seems to clearly come through the lens of we are not necessarily going to ameliorate polarization, but perhaps we could move towards a system that better manages it. And I think in a way, that's also what Ezra in his book, I mean, he has several solutions. Knowing Ezra Klein and following him, the real solution that he wants is eliminating the filibuster. He writes about this pretty constantly, and I think he would also be open to the characterization of his solution as being, oh, we're not going to resolve this divide, but perhaps we can better manage it. I mean, the term he uses to refer to this is, do we want to choose the problems of paralysis or the problems of governance? Right now, we have the problems of paralysis. A party comes in, the non-majority party that's out of power, again, assuming there's not a trifecta in the federal government, including a 60-vote supermajority. The party out of power will just prevent them from achieving their agenda. Then people go back towards the polls 4 years later, and when they don't have positive legislative achievements to run on, then it makes demonization of the enemy and negative polarization even that much more appealing and perhaps even logical. He would say that if we deal with the problems of governance, meaning you come in, it's usually the case that when the presidency changes party, he comes in with majorities in Congress, though maybe not supermajorities. They could pass their legislation and then 4 years later be judged accordingly. So you'll actually, you'll actually have, rather than having politicians run for office and then just trying not to screw up or go viral saying something, and then they can just run again in 4 years, just running on the same open, vapid political statements. It's like, okay, well, if you have 51 votes, pass it. And then let's see, do people like single payer? Do people like your this gun policy or whatnot? And then they could actually be held to account, as opposed to just being the lesser of two evils. Now, of course, that gets into the, I guess, erratic governance. It could be pretty easy for the one vote majority to flip every 2 years. So there's obviously some issues with that. But I think both of them would say it's probably irrational to think we could overcome this divide. So we should move towards better systems that can function within it.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that point, David French will say the fact that every election, especially the presidential election, is considered to be the election of our lifetime, like vote like your life depends on it, that is an indication that the system is failing, because his version of kind of federalism, where there's more power and control over the local government, the national election shouldn't matter that much. I mean, sure, every election is consequential, and I'm not undermining the powers that are given to the executive branch, but the idea that if we don't vote in a certain way or vote out a sitting president, then the world is over. I think that kind of fatalistic approach shows that, according to David French, if you have a more less of a top-down approach and having more local governments in power, then that will allow greater stability. And you're not always relying on, the high stakes elections. And, we just got through an election cycle, and, the first question that I asked Matthew is, well, hey, what did you think? Were you relieved? Were you, anxiety-ridden? I think all of us go through this kind of roller coaster ride every 4 years, sometimes every 2 years, depending on how closely the midterm elections are contested.
Also, so just going back to his first two questions, one, do we need an enemy? Two, if so, was the second one, if so, who would fill that role?
What can do, considering that now, due to the social media, both parties are living in separate facts. They're operating with different facts, interpretation of reality. Actually, it's not facts.
Right. Okay. So that last part is, I think, my biggest cause for pessimism. But do we need an external enemy? I think there's actually a lot of research that countries thrive when they have clear, identifiable external enemies. I mean, there's so many examples: World War II, the space race, the Cold War, all that stuff. Who would fit that? Who's to say? Seems like maybe China, for better or for worse, is but it seems like we don't have a clear answer to that right now. But of course, I mean, there's this thing called the rally around the flag effect, right? So whether it's 9/11 or whatever, when there's a threat on or an attack on America, I think Ezra would say that is an event that activates your American identity. It's one of the few instances where your identity as an American would supersede your identity as a partisan. And so, yeah, I mean, I think right now having a clear external enemy would be, I don't think it would be a solution, but it would be a bit of a sedative towards polarization. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly who would fit that bill right now.
Well, if you talk to David French, again, the title of his book is Divided We Fall, and then the subtitle is America's Secession Threat and how to restore our nation. So he talks about secession a lot, and he talks about two different types of secessions. The one that took place right after the Declaration of Independence, and then, of course, the American Civil War. And he talks about how the American Civil War was more of a unpredictable secession because, with the Declaration of Independence, because the two entities were so far apart that separated by the Atlantic Ocean, it was just logical that America would secede from the British rule. But this idea of a bunch of states next to one another, then departing from the Union was almost unthinkable. Well, the unthinkable did happen. And I think French's concern is that the enemy, as Klein is alluding to, will be the neighboring states, or the North versus South, or the coastal states versus the heart of America. And that's, I think, his concern, is that the enemy, the so-called enemy, will be kind of inward looking rather than outward looking. And as Matthew had mentioned, the rallying around the flag certainly, gives a lot of momentum to the sitting president, but that's only if the threat is external. If the threat is internal, that could have all kinds of devastating effects. So I guess if I had to put a positive spin on it, maybe the common enemy, for the lack of a better word, could be this virus, because again, it's a some certain pathogen that's affecting all of us. Doesn't matter if you're in red state, blue state, it doesn't matter what your age is, it affects all of us. So why not rally around that? But obviously the pandemic has shown that even the virus itself is very divisive. And David French talks about how the mask wars, right? If you wear a mask, then you're, succumbing to the libs, right? That's what he says. Whereas, if you don't want to be owned by the libs, then don't wear a mask, because it's our, individual liberty. So unfortunately, a lot of these things, the choices that we are presented with in life, are framed as, are you with the left or versus the right? And, I don't think there's an easy way to get out of it. Maybe there's something I'll mention in conclusion during our, remarks as we close the discussion about some ways that we could reform it. But I think every instance that we have, we always manage to find an internal dispute, thereby kind of weaponizing the other side, or weaponizing our, one's argument against the other side. So, all right, let's go to some other audience. Let's see, from, before we go on, Colleen, do we answer all of your questions? I know you have 3 questions. Hopefully we address
Yes.
most. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go with Lisa, then back to Sandy. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi. So a lot of times tonight we've been talking about what we can do regarding polarization on sort of a legislative level. It seems to me that one of the things that hits us the most in terms of our polarization is just voting in people that promote that as much as possible. And that seems to come a lot from the information that is deciphered down to us regarding media, Twitter, Facebook, etc. So I wanted to know if you guys had really any ideas really on the level of the information, the purity of the information that we get from our legislators that would discourage the type of polarization that rises in us as a people, that would lead us to continually fuel this, to elect the people that would, keep the cycle going, essentially.
Let me see if I understand your question correctly, Lisa. So are you, is the premise of your question is that the lawmakers and those who represent the citizenry, they are informed on bad set of facts, like fake news? Is that what you're concerned about?
My concern is that we're informed on bad set of facts from them, that we have devices such as Facebook and Twitter that allow them to decipher to us bad information, which fuels our need to polarize from the other guy to the guy that, you know, in our particular party that promotes what we think we want. And the cycle continues over and over again, because then we elect people who further that narrative, even on a superficial level. And so my question is there something that that can be done regarding the quality of information that they are allowed to decipher down to us, that would help eliminate over time the cycle of polarization that we also help create? So for example, you might have, let's say, like a Lindsey Graham tell his constituents that Biden wants to take all your babies or something. And you would have a certain amount of constituents that would agree with that and believe that. And then they would vote in the type of people that would that would support polarizing legislation that would keep that going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I could take a first attempt at responding, and then Matthew, maybe you have something else to add to it, which is, look, you have some voters who are just not engaged, and they only become engaged during the election year. And sometimes what animates them are single issues. Sometimes if there's no single issues to animate them, then they resort to the worst kind of the gutter politics, which is, you know, they're going to take your guns away, they're going to take your Bible away, or they're going to take your whatever away and make you drink Starbucks coffee. That's always, you know, I mean, nothing works in American politics than outright fear mongering. That's been going on forever. I think that's one kind of like bubble that you have. Another bubble is you have the press corps in Washington, D.C., where, or I mean, this is throughout the nation too, but especially where the power brokers are. The press doesn't do a very good job in the sense that they only report certain things very favorably, because if you are too critical, then guess what? You are denied access. So in order to have that access, and you know, there's this kind of race within the media landscape, the first person to break the news or the first person to do some kind of reporting, and they're rewarded by that competitive nature of breaking the news, that they kind of go along with it. And sometimes they need to portray things in a very favorable light. Or if not, then they lose access, and then the next company or reporter comes up to the plate to bat, and they're given the opportunity. So unfortunately, we have many different bubbles that exist, and I think just those two things being out there, it doesn't serve our communities well, because you have kind of underinformed voters acting on their fears, and also you have the media class only reporting on things like, who's up, who's down, who raised the most money. I mean, you could go to any media outlets during the election year, and that's really what they talk about. They talked about how many millions of dollars each candidate raised, as if we're talking about like, stocks going up or down. And to me, I think that's a bit of a disservice. So that's my initial reaction. What do you think, Matthew?
I feel like we're letting the public off too easily here. It just makes me think of the Shakespeare line, it is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. I mean, there's a market for all of this. I mean, there's a book written in 1985 called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's talking about the rise of television advertising and how it puts nuggets of information surrounded by this facade of like imagery and whatnot that could lead people towards thinking they're learning more and gaining knowledge, but it's actually leading them away from truly knowing things. It just seems like someone writing a book about our current social media era, except they happened to write it like before the internet. Well, the internet was invented, but before the internet was commercialized. I mean, I don't know. I agree with everything Thomas said, but I also think at the same time, like exciting politics is bad politics, but there's a market for exciting politics. There's not a market for most people aren't going to go and buy books and read and think critically about this for many understandable reasons. I mean, people have lives to live, but you know, when people's only engagement with politics is, you know, late night comedians or these, you know, 30-second videos of someone owning someone on Twitter, which is, I think, a lot of people's engagement with politics, why would you expect politicians to respond to that by giving you their 5-point plan and what academic papers back up their policy positions? Now, maybe I'm being a little overly critical, but I think when this topic comes up, most people, I think, are very quick to be more deferential to the public or the voter than they should be. I don't think we should assume that politics should be policy should be extremely simple and easy to understand.
So two things. Again, one kind of in deference of the voters and one kind of being critical. The critical part is, yes, I think we do need to, like each and every one of us need to hold ourselves up to a higher standard. And I think we're all, myself included, we do live in a very short-sighted, short attention span world where we're constantly dependent on what's out there in the media or social media, depending on how you get your information. And, you know, these systems kind of trigger our dopamine so that we, you know, have this kind of cyclic need every, whatever, 5, 10, 30 minutes to feed into what's going on. And I think these media outlets have done a tremendous job exploiting that and monetizing on that. And we are continuing to feed into that system. Unfortunately, that's kind of the reality. So on one hand, we need to be less dependent on these kind of glamorizing, sensationalizing, headline-grabbing stories, and look at more like investigative things. Like ProPublica comes to mind. They do a really good job doing investigative reporting. That's like, you know, many, many pages in depth with data, with irrefutable facts. I think that's the more type of information gathering that we need to do. Unfortunately, the reality is we live in a very complex society. So if you were to ask someone about healthcare, it's impossible to understand everything about how complex healthcare is. Gosh, who would have thought healthcare is so complex? Well, that's true. So anyway, that's quoting Donald Trump, by the way. But anyway, so I think we do live in a society where things are very complex, and you can't really expect every voter to have their research department to weigh all the, you know, pros and cons and get into all the nuances of policies. That's just a matter of the reality that we live in right now. Okay.
No, of course not. But I think we would all be better off and just more intellectually fulfilled by, I guess, actively rather than passively consuming politics. So reading and thinking critically more rather than just ingesting these videos and getting a kick out of someone, identification of someone's hypocrisy or whatnot like that. And I feel like that's also where there's all of these negative partisanship tendencies are activated much more so too, which kind of goes hand in hand with what you were saying. I mean, ProPublica is not putting out 30-second tweets of exciting findings. You know what I mean? They're putting out pretty nuanced, well-written stuff that, you know, and I'm not saying you have to go read a 300-page tome, but I think even just reading over passively ingesting videos, I think could probably go a long way towards a better informed public.
Yeah, and I think Ezra Klein would certainly underscore that point because, again, you know, people tend to view politics as like a full contact sport, which I guess to some extent there is that kind of competitive sport nature to politics. But when you look at it from like a zero-sum perspective, where, again, to use the sports analogy, you have the Yankee fan versus Boston Red Sox fans. And if everything is about defeating or owning the other side, then, well, there's really not much room for any productive, meaningful conversation or ideas. And I think that's the system that we're locked into. And of course, the long term, and this kind of alludes to what I was going to say for the conclusion, but I think at some point we do need to kind of be more creative in our educational system, where being civically minded is no longer like a nerdy thing. I mean, this is really what living in a free society is all about. You learn how to read, you learn how to write, and you learn how to engage. But the third part seems to be kind of missing out of from the equation. So that's another thing we should consider. Okay, let's go to next two sets of questions from Michael and back to Sandy. Go ahead, Michael.
All right, so I'm wondering, to what degree do you guys think that it's the responsibility of the individual to personally get to know people who are different from you? That might include, or maybe, I mean, I've read some articles that we're now moving to locations where we identify with a group of people in general that are in that place. Maybe we don't go to work anymore and have such a diverse group of people that we work with. So I'm wondering how much of this is our own responsibility to reach out across the dinner table or wherever and get to know people personally. And then maybe you come to find out, oh my gosh, they thought X way, and you maybe didn't agree with that group, but now that you know this person, you now might begin to form a different opinion with that group, and therefore come to understand what is important to them and yourself. And you may come to find out that you both have something in common. But to do that, I also think that perhaps we need to get away, as we were just talking about, the inflammatory media that seems to rile people up and polarize people. So I'm just wondering how much of this is the individual versus the politician actually making suggestions as to, crossing the aisle, or how much of this is the individual that we then force the politicians to come together because we, as differing people, have come together. I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Well, I feel like your question kind of evolved. I think there were like two parts to it. One was reaching across the dinner table. So just individuals in the country, how much of a responsibility do we have towards actively getting to know and understand people of different political stripes than us? And then separately, I think you also had how we reflect that upon our politicians and demand that of them, right? So there's,
right.
I guess
right.
I was thinking more so towards the former. I don't know who said this originally, but I definitely feel like a lot of people are, they talk to be understood, they discuss to be understood, not to understand, which I think just summarizes it really well. Most people, I feel like when it comes to politics, and it happens in this group sometimes, often when we're talking basically all the events right after 2016, the stuff that's dealing with the current event, hot topic stuff. Sometimes people, and they finally get the chance to talk, and clearly they weren't listening. They were just waiting for their opportunity to say their position, which obviously, I mean, this group is nothing without people coming to share their opinions, but it's much richer when you're there and willing to mold your idea and actually say, okay, hold on, I disagree with this, but you said this. Was that because of that or because of something else? And I think just like being willing to be vulnerable in terms of asking those questions, being curious. I mean, like, why did you vote for that person? Was it this or that? Like, what set of facts are you operating under? That's the only, I mean, if you look at it as a solution of do we do that or do we not do that? The answer seems pretty obvious. Now, that's not saying that's a silver bullet solution, but I don't know. People always say, like, at Thanksgiving or in family events, they don't want to talk about politics. And I feel like that's the most important time to talk about politics, not to fight or to argue. But I feel like politics is downstream of culture, and it really is it can often be a lens towards learning more about the other people. And then you go off talking about their values in a context that's not related to politics. But given that politics is so serious, and I mean, in many, depending on the policy area, it can be life or death if you want to take it that far. I think we do have a responsibility to reach out to our fellow citizens, particularly the ones that we don't agree with. You know, that's like when David French is talking about tolerance. You know, we say people now use the term tolerance to be indicative of how many historically marginalized groups they like, whereas the different meaning of tolerance is, well, how do you respond when you're engaging with people who you don't like, people who have ideas you find repugnant? You know, free speech is for the speech you hate. It's not for the speech you like. All those types of concepts. I think that underlying message in his book is very well received by me, because it seems like we just need to work towards a little bit less just talking to be understood and a little bit more communicating to understand.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, sometimes it's okay to be wrong. I mean, not wrong in terms of you're operating on the wrong set of facts, but maybe your conclusions maybe was not the most wise conclusion. And I mean, I'll say myself in this group, there were many times, not many times, but there are certainly a number of occasions where after listening to other members, I was able to at least refresh my views on certain things and come up with a more, all-encompassing view on some issues. And that's okay. And I think we are in a society now where if you're wrong, then instantly you have to double down because, being wrong shows weakness and somehow you're immoral or you're, infallible. You're fallible. No, I think being wrong is perfectly okay as long as it's a genuine kind of like, understanding, and that you're not doing it for some kind of like a self-motivating purpose. Like you're not a politician and now you're saying, oh, well, I was wrong to vote this way. No, I vote that way. No, that's very self-serving. But as non-member of the public official, I think it's okay to be wrong. So we don't need to always double down on wrong information. That's number one. Number two is Ezra Klein talked about how we tend to caricature people on the opposite side because we have this misunderstandings about certain statistics, but it turns out that that's just an extreme version of the caricature that they're lampooning. And I think when you talk to whether if it's a Trump supporter or even a Bernie Sanders supporter, very wide spectrum of very wide spectrum of ideology, but it turns out that most people are pretty decent. And I think only the dark underbelly of the ugly side gets portrayed in the media. One thing I try to do, and this works for me, but maybe it doesn't work for others in this group, so take it for what it is. For me personally, I have this kind of 80-20 rule. What I mean by that is there are certain things I believe in. After the course of studying, reading, talking to people about it, I'm pretty sure that 80% of what I believe in is fairly consistent with my values. But then I always leave room for that 20%. Now, that 20% means I'm susceptible to corruption, to bad thoughts. No, but I could be wrong in that 20%. So what I do is when I talk to other people who might have different viewpoints, I automatically assume that, okay, I think that person, 80% of them are pretty reasonable. And there's 20% maybe we disagree. And I think by having that kind of balance where I take them at their face value, they're not out there to do something odious or heinous. They are well-intentioned. It just, we have a different life experience. We live in different places. We have different, narratives that brought us together. I think if we look at others that way, then we tend to demonize them less. And I think that's how we should try to approach others too, because, even in this group, we've had plenty of people who I thought, wow, their ideas are really out there. But even that, my impression of them having a very, let's just say, extreme ideas, 20% was actually pretty reasonable. So if we could see each other on the same page on that 20% level, at least that's a good starting point. Now, does that mean we need to always operate in a 20% consensus? No, that's just, for me, like a benchmark. That's a good place to start. But I think one thing we need to understand is, like Matthew said, we need to listen to others, and sometimes it's okay to be proven wrong. You need to discuss instead of just you being the only person talking or talking over each other. So I think one important lesson is we really do need to listen to one another. And I think we're in a time period where we're in this kind of like post-truth world where you can see one story and there's so many different angles to it. So I can see how that is very easily susceptible to being manipulated. So
I guess
anyway,
one other thing I would add, going along with the theme of Ezra's book, is I've always been really resistant towards labels. I have a hard time when people say, "Are you a liberal?" And it's like, yeah, well, no, because I can think of all these areas where they would assume I think this or that, and they're like, "All right, well, so you're conservative?" And I'm like, yeah, well, no, or whatever. So I think we're like, to consciously acknowledge a self-adorned label is kind of to consciously take on or subconsciously take on an identity. And I feel like a lot of times you see people, whether it's at the dinner table at Thanksgiving next week, or on a panel on whatever cable news show, the conversation starts to shift, and then people end up defending things that maybe they don't necessarily believe, or arguing about things that are a little bit separate from what they were really talking about, because you take on this kind of team label when you're consciously acknowledging this identity. So that was just one thing I wanted to add, because it seems Ezra doesn't say that explicitly, but it seems like it pretty much jumps out of the pages more or less if you read the book.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if we had, let's say, 100 teams to choose from, and you're one of maybe 100 teams, I guess that's one thing. Maybe you're not as boxed in by being labeled as something. And I think being labeled is almost inevitable, because we live in a society where everything is identified, categorized, labeled based on who you are, what you do, etc. But when we're in a two-party system, and when you're labeled into something, then it really boxes you in, and you don't have the intellectual freedom then to think beyond those boundaries. And at least one thing we try to do in this group, I don't know how successful I am, but we always try to create a room for independent thinking. So if you join this group and say, I'm independent minded, I want to hear all ideas, that's great, because that's kind of what we try to do. People already have this kind of presupposition that, oh, well, this is a New York City based group, so it must be very liberal. Well, that depends on who joins the group. But I think, if all of us could at least tolerate, going back to that word from David French, tolerate open ideas and exchanges, then I think that will allow us to broaden our views. And I think having those broadened views really help a lot, because ultimately, in our everyday lives, we all have our individual interactions and individual ways of getting information that formulates who we are. But if we could share that in this kind of open setting, I think that will certainly make it more healthy.
Yeah, and I guess another way you could talk about labels. So they're most common, and the identity stuff, most common at the national scale, in terms of national campaigns and national parties. But it's interesting that, so Florida just voted Republican by a bit more than people were expecting, yet they also overwhelmingly approved $15 minimum wage. And in California, they obviously voted very heavily Democratic, but at the same time, overwhelmingly voted against a referendum to re-legalize affirmative action. So like, people actually are, fairly complex. This is getting back to those two quadrants that never get truly catered to from earlier in the discussion. People are, genuinely, they have sophisticated beliefs. It's not necessarily the case that knowing one thing about them tells you the whole suite of their political views, but it does tend to be the case that way when we're talking about highly politicized, highly covered, high visibility national campaigns, because it's just, there's so much mixed messaging and demonization of the opponent going on.
Yeah, and again, bringing it back to this idea of David French's view of federalism, if we were to decentralize a lot of these contests, then we wouldn't have as much emotional investment into these races. So yes, of course, we want people to get energized and vote, but these are not like do or die type of election contests. And the more these things are kind of viewed as kind of like an ultimatum almost, I think it creates a very toxic atmosphere. So, all right, let's see, Sandy has her hand up. Go ahead, Sandy.
So with polarization, I've read that, yes, there is more polarization now than there has been in the last few decades, but the polarization is kind of asymmetric. So Democrats have moved somewhat to the left, but apparently Republicans have moved quite a lot to the right. And it's to the point now where some people say if Ronald Reagan was to run today, he wouldn't even get elected because the party has just moved farther away from what he used to stand for. So, it's kind of surprising how much people can get polarized in a short period of time. But in some ways, it's also a little reassuring because it makes me think, maybe that could be reversed, if the media environment or the social media ecosystem or something was to change, maybe we could, be less polarized in the future. So I wonder what you all think of that. And then Thomas, you had talked about the sports analogy for politics. That was how I used to think of politics in the old days, but now I kind of think of it as like a religion politics. So, there are Trump supporters who literally worship Donald Trump. And there are some people who are ready to go on a crusade for their political beliefs. So it's just become much more fanatical in recent years. So to me, I wish it was like sports now because that was, a lot more mild. But right now it's really fanatical, emotional, and it seems almost religious at least for a lot of people. So curious to hear your thoughts.
I'll go first. And the first point about, well, who is more extreme, the Democrats or Republicans? Well, I think the Overton window shifts in many different ways. And I think to look at it in a very binary kind of way is probably not the accurate representation. It's more like three-dimensional. So on some issues, yes, the progressives have moved more to the left. On other issues, the Republicans have moved more to the right. You mentioned about Ronald Reagan. Well, can he get the nomination if he were to run in the modern era? The answer is no, because he was for amnesty. And how dare you, even bring up the word amnesty in the Republican Party? Well, likewise, I think John F. Kennedy, who a lot of Democrats kind of hold up as their, savior in some ways. And yet, we talked about this kind of like a religiosity of politicians. Well, it seems like in some household, Kennedy is revered as like a saint too. But be that as it may, I think Kennedy would certainly have a hard time being elected in the modern Democratic Party because he was in favor of tax cuts and deregulation. And he was very hawkish in foreign policy. So I think these things are pretty complex. Sometimes it's really hard to compare that era versus now because obviously the challenges are a lot different, the demographics are different, the makeup of the party is different. So you could certainly, selectively pick certain things to make an argument that one candidate will not be viable now compared to back then. But I think if you look at it, I think both sides have really kind of sorted themselves out in a sense that you don't really have liberal Republicans anymore or conservative Democrats anymore because everything's been sorted out. And that was pretty much done, I think, in the 70s. But by the time we got to that era, that's been already well, sorted out. So it's a really issue by issue thing. And, I'm sure some progressives wish that, they were more like FDR, why can't they be more like FDR? And I'm sure some conservatives wish that, why can't, somebody be more like Barry Goldwater? Fair enough, but it's a very complex way to look at it. In terms of this kind of fanatical cult personality, I think that's nothing new in American politics. I think when we are living in an era where it's highly polarized, and those who don't support the person in power i.e. Donald Trump, then maybe you might look at it that way. But I remember when President Obama was elected, I remember one of his speeches that he gave was something like, "We are the ones that we've been waiting for." It's like a very like a messianic tone. So this idea that, you know, people worship the feet of these politicians, I mean, that goes way back. We had a panel discussion on Trump supporters right before the election. We had three individuals, three members of this group who are identified as pro-Trump supporters. And their view is, look, every politician out there has been making certain promises, and they always, you know, kind of have this, you know, Washington talk, but they wanted a candidate that they could identify with, you know, the proverbial, you know, a candidate that I could have a beer with. Well, they decided that Trump is the right candidate. You know, that populist message resonated with them. So, you know, to me, I think we are in a society where it's well within reason to adore or admire the elected officials. Now, when does that become toxic? Well, I think we've had many instances like that. And going back to your analogy about sports fans, well, I know many sports fans who, on one hand, they follow sports like a very casual, okay, let's, you know, have some drinks and watch the game, versus they fanatically, you know, follow these, you know, athletes, like they collect their uniforms and know all the statistics in the back of their minds. So, I mean, I think that's kind of a human tendency. And because in the US, we don't have like an official religion, I think they tend to gravitate towards, you know, going back to this idea of a patriarchal society, we tend to kind of gravitate to the figurehead or the head of state to seek some kind of like a moral authority. So what do you think, Matthew?
I tend to agree with what you were saying. I feel like these questions, I feel like it's very, any argument that is saying today is the worst it's ever been or the most extreme it's ever been, I feel like is always seductive. But I guess more in terms of asymmetric polarization, I feel like you can always make your case for whatever side you want, depending on where you put the beginning of that window. I mean, for example, what if we just put the beginning of the window at 2015 and the topic is socialism? I mean, many Democratic candidates would run away, almost all of them would run away screaming from the label socialism just a short 5 years ago. Now you have like a sizable segment of the party that's like, hey, we're Democratic Socialists of America. So I do think what I agree most strongly with that Thomas said is, I do think it really does matter issue by issue. I mean, Obama and Hillary in 2008, they wouldn't openly talk about being pro-gay marriage. Nowadays, just not a decade later, that question would never even come up. That's such a foregone like, obviously, if you're running for the Democratic Party, you're in support of gay marriage. We've moved on to more polarized or more extreme, not in a positive or negative sense, issues in the LGBTQ realm. And that's been a lot of really big changes in just 12 years. Now, of course, there's obviously a whole bunch of examples on the other side too, but I feel like sometimes we just focus on the excesses of the other side without looking at the ways that topics have been pulled in the direction. We focus on our losses more than on our wins, I guess.
The motto for the National Review magazine used to be something like, when there's a fast-moving freight train of change that's supposed to just, you know, be ramrodded, their job is to just say stop, just put everything on hold and let the momentum stop. I think it was something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing.
Yes, stand athwart history and you'll stop.
Thank you. So I think you could look at the kind of the polarized, you know, partisan nature of the U.S. politics, especially in the 20th century, as exactly that. So you have kind of, you know, think of politics as like this, you know, gravitational resistance. So on one hand, you have the more kind of traditionalists or conservatives that are anchored in the traditional ways, and they're doing everything they can to preserve that for the good or for bad. They're saying this is something we need to preserve. And the rate at which the progressives want to keep on changing it is so toxic that we need to defend this thing that has existed for the last 150, 200 years. Now, as they're trying to anchor it down so that it's more stable and gravitated, that kind of bruise, if you look underneath it, there's a lot of extremism that comes out of it. And sometimes that extremism is fueled by someone being very unreasonable and just taking a very bad faith position. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, the rate of change that they're trying to have this come about, that's the freight train that I was talking about from the National Review motto. The change is so rapid that we don't even have a chance to sit down, take a breather, understand what's going on, and assess everything. It's happening so fast that itself, that movement, is also creating this force of extremism and unreasonableness. So yeah, these two, almost like a black hole, if you will, that are just kind of perpetuating because of these two ideological motives. So what do we do about that? I think that's kind of where we are stuck right now. If I could, represent it in those physics-related terms. So anyway, okay, let's go to, let's see, anyone else? Questions? All right, I guess we'll kind of wrap this up then, if there's no other questions. So again, we talked about a lot of negatives and, how we got here, why we're polarized. But, I guess there are some solutions that the books recommend. So maybe Matthew, you want to talk about maybe what are some of the things that we could undertake at least to lessen the divide?
So the ones that I recall, I think I've mentioned. I mean, the one that sticks with me the most is I really like David French's call for increased tolerance. I'm not positive that enhanced federalism is the best way to take that, but in general, I think rather than jumping down each other's throats when someone says something that we find offensive to our political values or something, and seeking to understand why they believe what they believe, and just understanding that there are people out there that believe things very differently from you, just as passionately as you do, and that's okay. I think having that mindset, which isn't to say, there are certainly some beliefs that are, flatly terrible, but I think giving that benefit of the doubt, or just being comfortable with people disagreeing with you vehemently, it's a little thing, but it's something that if everyone did it, I think you'd immediately see the temperature of the country go down a little bit. Not every election is a Flight 93 election, and not every political opponent is your enemy.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that point. I think if you want to have a robust society, sure, it's great to have debates, it's great to have disagreements, but let's have disagreements on more substantive differences rather than, these little, hate to, reduce them down to petty differences, but sometimes they are. If you just go on Twitter, you see all these, fights or debates that go on, and sometimes they tend to be a bit more petty in nature because it's very transactional, and there's nothing, significant or aspirational that comes out of it. So, I think if we could, kind of avoid resorting to those kind of petty disputes where, if you're a conservative, your, mission in life is to own the libs, right? And if you're, somebody that's progressive, you're trying to show conservatives that they are, anti-math or anti-science. To me, I think that kind of view of the world is very toxic. But if I could also maybe provide a recommendation, and sometimes I'm kind of hesitant because I think we are away from the era where once upon a time, maybe 20, 30 years ago, they would have said, oh, well, we just all have to, congregate, hold hands, sing kumbaya, and we all need to, have this grand, bipartisanship, the skies will open, the gates of opportunities will flourish. I think that era is gone. I think if you look at it from a more practical standpoint, that all of us could do on a everyday occurrence is this. I think we all need to kind of broaden our media diet. What I mean by that is one of the questions that I post when you join this meetup group is, which outlets do you enjoy for news consumption? And there's a reason why I asked that question, because I think it's to everyone's benefit if you kind of diversify how you get your information. And I think you have to look at media diet as like your regular diet. So, if somebody comes up to you and says, wow, I love eating carbohydrates every day, that's so great. Well, okay, that might be good now, but it's not going to be so healthy, years down the road. And I think that happens with media too. I think if you just go to your favorite websites that you have bookmarked and keep going back multiple times a day, then that's going to further create a confirmation bias, and it'll just perpetuate the stereotypes. And I think sometimes, if you're a progressive or someone who identifies as progressive, sure, it's helpful to at least understand what's going on the other side. Not that you're going there to, have your views be persuaded one way or the other, but at least understand the framing of the question. Because again, using that 80-20 rule that I always use, I try to get information from other places, 80% of it, knowing that I'm pretty confident that my views are pretty solid, but I'm open to that 20% of maybe those views will broaden my knowledge. So I think we should all at least try to broaden our media diet so that you're not always getting your news from one source. And I think that's probably the most toxic thing you can do, because ultimately, if you think about these media outlets, they're all saying the same thing. Every outlet has their self-interest to perpetuate these stories. And I think they tend to over glamorize it. So if you could at least, maybe a couple times a week or whatever, just go to a different, it doesn't have to be like a sensationalist website. It could be a blog, could be analysis, could be opinion piece, and just try to understand what the other side is saying. And if you apply that 80-20 rule, I think you will at least gain some fresh perspective and walk away thinking that, well, maybe the other side is not so crazy. Maybe they are good faith actors. We just don't, have the same conclusion, which is perfectly okay. So,
or even simpler, Thomas, maybe if you're right of center, read more Ezra Klein, and if you're left of center, read more David French. I think they're both very well-spoken, well-written individuals who are moored by good principles. And if you're getting too much of the left, then maybe you should read more about David French. He's a very thoughtful conservative. And if you are thrown off by progressive policies and you don't understand how anyone could support them, well, go read some Ezra Klein. He puts forward some strong arguments for those. So.
Yeah, good point. And also to, I think Sandy's point, because, we do tend to put these elected officials on a higher pedestal. I think it's perfectly okay to criticize the person that you voted for, because again, the idea is you want to hold these elected officials accountable and hold their feet to the fire. So I think by giving them too much deference, that kind of gets us blindsided with some critical thinking. So whoever the elected official is, Joe Biden, Trump, doesn't matter. I think it's always to have a healthy dose of skepticism and criticism is always, useful in our society. Okay. So any other final thoughts before we wrap up? All right, well, I guess that'll be all. Thank you everyone for a enlightening discussion. The next one we're going to do will be on this coming Tuesday. It's going to be on the so-called election fraud and the ongoing ballot recounts. And this one we have some special guests that'll be joining us, an attorney from Bush v. Gore litigation, as well as an investigative reporter from USA Today. So looking forward to that. Otherwise, thank you everyone. Be well. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.